Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The No Man's Land. I am Angela Ramirez and today is January 26th, 2021. Today we're going to be talking about something that happened earlier in the week on January 18th, which was just before Biden's inauguration day. There was a ICE facility that was attacked in San Francisco, California, and there were some things that I wanted to just touch on and explain that I felt were really important to document. There is, as usual, an article up on my site that you guys can read if you're more of a reader. But yeah, I'm just going to be going through this article, giving you guys some of the information about what happened, and I'm going to be talking about what it means for 2021, at least what my analysis is on it. So let's get into it. The title of this article is Antifa Sets Sights on Prison Breaks and Claims Credit for ICE Office Attack. So those of you guys who have been following what Antifa has done in the past, specifically 2020, you know that one of their primary targets has been government facilities that are linked to the U.S. prison system, the U.S. immigration detention system, and I guess police facilities in general. So that's why when you look at Portland, which is pretty much a hotbed of Antifa activity, you see a lot of attacks on not only the ICE facility, but also the police, not necessarily the stations, but the precincts. So the police precincts, that they'll go after those. And really what you see is continuous low-grade attacks that are designed to wear down the officers that are in that station, as well as wear down the building itself. So one of the things that happens most often is Antifa will target police precincts, etc., and they will graffiti it, they'll break the windows, they'll attempt to set small fires that, obviously they're not intended to be small, they are intended to burn down the facility, but what they're doing is they're destroying the facility to the point where repairing it gets to be so laborious that it actually hinders the facility's operations as a whole. And so what we're seeing right now in California, this is, I think, one of the first attacks in California of this magnitude. There have been direct action attacks in the past, but when I looked up this specific facility in general to see what record there was of Antifa targeting this specific ICE facility, it had been about 2 years since this actual building had been targeted. California usually does not see Antifa activity to the magnitude that we see in like Portland and Seattle and the Pacific Northwest. But now, at the beginning of 2021, we are seeing Northern California experience direct action attacks at the hand of Antifa. And so this is probably one of the most extensive, and it's not just the attack itself that I find very interesting. It was the fact that Antifa had actually claimed responsibility for conducting this attack, and on top of that, in their claim of responsibility, they actually provided justification for why they chose to target the facility and what their long-term goal was after, what their long-term goal was with the specific direct action march. So let's get into it. Antifa sets sights on prison breaks, claims credit for ICE office attacks. All right, so on the night of January 18th, obviously 2021, an Immigration and Citizenship Enforcement facility was vandalized and breached in San Francisco, California. For those of you guys not really familiar with California, that is the northern end of the state. It is relatively close to the state line between California and Oregon. All right, so ICE facilities are a regular target of Antifa operatives, and the attack on the 18th featured all of the hallmarks of Antifa's anarcho-communist activity, including politically extreme graffiti and broken windows. The following day, a radical left news site headquartered in California's Bay Area, which is the San Francisco area, published an article written by an anonymous author claiming credit for that operation. The author went on to state that prisons and detention centers would be a target in the future, and that they hope to trigger a series of break-ins and escapes in their future operations. Now, in the article here, I do state that it would become a goal for 2021 operations. The reason that I stated that specifically, that I'm specifically calling out their operations for 2021, is basically because this direct action attack was done at the very beginning of January, and we have a whole year to go. Also, because Joe Biden being put into office seems to have triggered more Antifa cells throughout the nation to become more active again. We saw a really strange lapse in activity from these groups while the election was being finalized, and everything was just there was a lot going on in DC during the election validation process. I think everybody knows that there was a lot of controversy, and during that time, while electors were being certified, Antifa really laid low, it seemed. And it's not really clear whether that was to recalibrate or if they were kind of just waiting things out to see which way the tides were changing, if the tides were changing. But this past week with Joe Biden getting into office, it seems that we are seeing a lot more Antifa activity across the board. This is not just in California. We saw Antifa marches and riots in Seattle, Portland, Northern California. We also saw a rally in Denver, Colorado, where rhetoric was spewed that was pretty politically extreme. And then there was another one in Columbus, Ohio that remained truly peaceful. But nonetheless, there were Antifa flags there were anti-fascists there. A lot of them were in plain clothes as far as the Ohio rally. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here. So the San Francisco vandalization, Antifa actually claimed credit for that attack on a website called indiebay.com. Actually, I'm sorry, it's indiebay.org. So, indiebay.org, they published an article. It was written by an anonymous author who claimed credit for the vandalization. The reason that I think that's so interesting is because claims of credit seem to be picking up these days. There was, if you guys remember, the Department of Justice recently charged 2 individuals in the Pacific Northwest for placing shunts on a railroad. And shunts, what they do is they interfere with the communications, the electronic communications between the train's braking system and the railroad, the blocks that go over the roads to prevent cars from crossing the railroad while a train is coming. So the Department of Justice actually just charged 2 people for placing those shunts on the road. But prior to that happening, the website, It's Going Down, they actually published an article in which a claim of credit was included in that article for placing shunts on the tracks. And the FBI actually cited that in their criminal complaint when they were discussing these charges that were being brought against these 2 individuals in the PNW. And I think that's really interesting because now we're starting to see not just direct action attacks and direct action operations, but we're actually starting to see Antifa-linked websites come forward and claim credit for these actions. And I don't think I have to tell anybody that that's a common tactic used by, I don't know if it's a tactic, but that's a common theme among terror organizations. And I do find it very interesting that Antifa is taking that route now, that they're not just, going out and committing a crime. They're going out committing a crime and then going online and kind of bragging about it. So I do find that very interesting. Another reason that this claim of credit was, I feel, extremely important to document was because the author, who was anonymous, they published in that claim of credit that their goal was to spur a series of prison and detention center break-ins and breakouts. So, I mean, obviously a breakout would be an escape from prison or detention centers, and I do feel that it's really important to document that this threat or promise was made online. So let's get into it. Indie Bay, they published an article from an anonymous author who claimed credit for that ICE facility attack. The author actually said that it was 30 plus anti-racists who conducted the attack, and we're going to get into that linguistics a little bit later in the video. But the author actually announced, and I quote, that the author announced that the purpose of the attack was to, quote, spark a series of prison breaks into and breaks out of prisons. Oh, sorry, hold on, I totally butchered that. The quote is, they wanted to initiate a series of breaks into and breaks out of prisons and detention centers throughout the country, and to show everyone where abolitionists and anarchists stand. So that is the quote there. I find that very interesting because obviously they're hoping to trigger prison breaks and breaks into prisons. Obviously, Antifa has been calling for free them all for quite some time, and free them all means free all prisoners. It's also kind of important to point out that there is a parallel interest there between Antifa and Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has been pushing to completely abolish the prison system as a whole and to completely abolish ICE as a whole. So there are very parallel interests and goals between Antifa and Black Lives Matter. That said, I think that when you look at the actual crime itself, it points more towards Antifa as opposed to Black Lives Matter, which is why I did an analysis on the graffiti, which we're going to go into right now. So what is the supporting evidence for Antifa's claim of credit? So, like, how do we know that this was an Antifa operation? Because we don't have video of the direct action, and usually when we have video, it's really easy to tell if this is Antifa or a different organization, because Antifa typically comes in black bloc, but we don't have video of this. So we have to rely on what we do have, which is photographs of what the building, what type of graffiti is on the building, as well as this article here. And thankfully, I have a lot of thankfully there's been so many journalists documenting this, like these riots on the ground, that it's possible to really compare and make a solid conclusion. So in this instance, the number one thing that I feel points towards Antifa, just looking at the crime scene itself, the pictures that we have of it, the Indie Bay article, they actually published photos that they had taken of the crime scene. So what happened was they committed the vandalism, and then they took pictures of their work. So it was kind of like token photography. So the graffiti that was all over the building, and on top of that, the smashed windows, is pretty unique to Antifa. And the reason that is because here, if you guys are looking at the screen, you'll see these A's in circles. That typically that's an anarchist symbol, but also it's very heavily used by Antifa. They use it when they write Antifa, they usually circle the A in that word. Next to it says, "For a world without borders," "slavery never ended" is also on there. Those are all phrases that are pretty commonly used by Antifa. Not to say that they aren't ever used by Black Lives Matter, but usually Black Lives Matter will tag different types of graffiti. And I think something that I really need to do in the future is to start documenting the types of graffiti left behind from Antifa riots, so that there's like a catalog of known Antifa graffiti, kind of similar to how like there's a gang database and graffiti is in those gang databases. I think it would be helpful to have like a Antifa graffiti database. So that's something that's a little project that I think I'm starting. Anyway, so there's also broken windows, and Antifa is a huge fan of just breaking windows. It's part of their vandalization tactics. Just a few other photos here. Oh, let's see. A few other photos here are ICE. ICE is obviously the Immigration and and Citizenship Enforcement. So F-ICE is a pretty common phrase used by Antifa and Antifa graffiti. I think they just tagged that up in Seattle during the last riot that they had, I want to say a couple days ago. Right above F-ICE, it says no justice. No justice, no peace is also kind of a term that's used both by BLM and Antifa, but in this instance, I'm leaning more towards it being Antifa than Black Lives Matter. Also here on this right hand side, the picture on the right hand side, you see broken windows, and they're not totally broken, but they are damaged. Again, Antifa makes a habit out of vandalizing windows. Windows are a pretty easy target. And then something else that's interesting is these just blotches of red paint. Usually what they do there is it's just like water balloons filled with paint, and it's been pretty well documented that Antifa will use water balloons filled with paint. So yeah, that's the supporting evidence for why I believe that this is an Antifa operation. I think that the A's in the circles are pretty self-explanatory when you look at other Antifa graffiti. The A is pretty unanimously used. So going forward, the language. I think the language also is a really good example as to why this is an Antifa operation. So Antifa, anti-fascists, they speak in a really specific way. Like, they don't use everyday English, in my opinion. Like, they have this whole rhetoric that they promote on their blogs, and it all sounds very similar. So they have like their own unique linguistic style. And this InDebate article that claimed credit for the attack, I looked over the stylistics that they used, and in my opinion, it seems to point pretty clearly to Antifa. So one of the things that stood out to me was that the author stated that there was a mob of 30 anti-racists. That was the phrase that they used. So anti-racist is used both by Black Lives Matter and Antifa. Obviously, as we go through this, you're seeing there's a lot of similarities between the language and ideas of Black Lives Matter and Antifa. One is really a little bit just more militant than the other. Black Lives Matter is a little more willing to participate in adjusting politics, whereas Antifa is very much not interested really in participating in politics. They are more interested in using direct action to force their way through things, whereas Black Lives Matter is maybe more willing to engage in direct action geared towards changing policies. That said, the term anti-racist is used by both Antifa and Black Lives Matter, but a lot of Antifa operatives do use the phrase anti-racist and anti-fascist interchangeably. So a good example for that would be Eric King, who is an Antifa operative currently serving out a prison sentence in Colorado. He is in prison right now for a very badly failed attempt at bombing a government official's office. He tried to make Molotov cocktails and apparently didn't know how to do it, so the Molotov cocktails didn't actually explode, but obviously it was an attempted bombing nonetheless, and so now he's in prison for that. And so there was recently, it's funny because this actually like really helped out this research that I did for the article. Eric King just did an interview with It's Going Down, which I just referenced a little bit earlier. He did an interview with the writers at It's Going Down. Again, this was published by an anonymous contributor, but here we have the Free Them All, Free Eric King banner with the anti-fascist A or anarchist A there, which is pretty much exactly what we see over here in the photo taken of the San Francisco ICE facility. As you can see, that's a match. So he just did a interview with It's Going Down, and in that interview he was asked a question What do you notice about the different populations in prison? How they're treated? How has your position affected your treatment? And in his answer, he said, my position as an anti-racist, anti-fascist person. Now, it's really interesting because he put anti-racist first, and it was, anti-racist / anti-fascist. So he actually referred to himself as anti-fascist second and anti-racist first. And as you can see, it was kind of an interchangeable turn of phrase. So when you hear the word anti-racist, it's not always Black Lives Matter. It's important to realize that Antifa also considers themselves anti-racist because they consider racism a symptom of fascism. So that is one reason I found this term 30 so-called 30 anti-racist, that's why that jumped out at me, because Antifa will also use that phrasing. Next, the Antifa, just the site it's going down, has a history of using the term anti-racist that is sourced or cited in my article. Also, another site called Torch Antifa, which is exclusively dedicated to militant Antifa activism, they also use the term anti-racist in their writings. And, obviously, torchantifa.org, it's an Antifa website. They make it pretty easy for you to figure that out. It's not like something that you have to analyze. But yeah, so anti-racist is a phrase that's often used by Antifa militants. Another good giveaway was at the end of the article that claimed credit for this attack. They included Death to America, which, and in America they spelled it with 3 Ks instead of the C. That is obviously, a jab at suggesting that America is built on the foundational philosophies of the KKK, and that thus there's no real need to spell America properly. It would be just as accurate using the 3 Ks. So that is pretty much almost always used by Antifa cells. I really haven't seen very many Black Lives Matter activists using that spelling. Here we have the Denver Communists, which is a Antifa group based up in central Colorado. They use that phrasing pretty often. It's right here in a Facebook post they published just recently from January 20th. Also, Torch Antifa uses that phrasing as well. They used the 3 Ks for their 2018 conference promotion, and you guys can look at that source also in my article. So yeah, I think between the graffiti and the linguistics that were used in that article, it's pretty clear that it was an Antifa operation. Even though we don't have video of the direct action attack, it's pretty clear from the results of the vandalism as well as this article that was published that this is an Antifa operation. Now, you might be thinking, is there an Antifa cell up in Northern California? Yes, there is. There's a group called San Francisco Anti-Fascists in that region. So it's pretty... it's not like this is a dead zone of Antifa activity. San Francisco Anti-Fascists are a pretty active group. I think they're a little bit newer than some of the other Antifa groups that we have, like in Seattle, Portland, and New York. But that said, they have been pretty active, and we do know that there were Antifa activists in San Mateo County, which is really not far from San Francisco. And they were out on January 20th. They were going around and spray painting buildings. They spray painted the San Mateo County Probationary Department sign that day. So that said, I think I'm just gonna move on to what is IndieBay.com, what is IndieBay.org in general. So like I said, this claim of credit was published onto IndieBay, and it is basically like a hub for anti-fascist information and news in specifically the Northern California area, the Bay Area, San Francisco, but they do cover anti-fascist news from other areas as well. It's just not as focused on those national topics. It's very much focused on San Francisco, the Bay Area, Berkeley, California. There is a Antifa group that is in Berkeley, in the Berkeley area. Something that I found really interesting about Indie Bay was when I was looking into their site, I noticed that they actually have a fiscal sponsor so that they can obtain 501c3 tax deductible status, and I don't understand how this keeps happening. I have come across so many groups that are linked with like militant operations and supporting communist, anarcho-communist activity that use a fiscal sponsor in order to like gain the tax benefits of being a charitable organization, which is like really it's very interesting to me that this is such a trend. But yeah, so Indie Bay, they are not themselves a 501c3 because you would have to go through the IRS to do that, but what they do is they obtain a fiscal sponsor who basically like vouches for them in order for them to obtain that tax deductible status. And so Indie Bay is using that process so that they can, you know, operate as a charity without actually having to go through all the hoops of being a charity. On their site, they receive donations through PayPal, and they claim to have received $212 in January of 2021. So not a whole lot, but they are, you know, they're getting some cash coming in through their site. Some of the topics that they publish on the site include things about police abolition, obviously anti-American sentiments, and support of indigenous struggles. That is another thing that a lot of Antifa groups support, is like instead of referring to an area, like for example, in Colorado, the Colorado anti-fascists, like instead of saying Denver, they'll say occupied Ute territory. So they'll call it occupied territory of whatever indigenous group was living on that land before European colonists came and settled there. So this site kind of also pushes that narrative of indigenous struggle. Another thing that's important to note is that Indie Bay is an open publishing website, which is basically similar to like how some coding programs have open source coding, so you can be like anybody can come in and change the code of that program. Indie Bay allows anybody to come in and publish content, write an article, upload photos without going through an editorial process. So you could just go on there, publish an article, hit submit, it would show up on the site, and then administrators would come through and moderate that content. Very similar to how like Reddit operates. It, like you would have, you know, a thread, somebody publishes it, and then if it's appropriate or needs improvement, the moderator would come in and make adjustments after it had been published. So that's kind of how Indie Bay works. Anyway, yeah, so all this goes to say that the claim of credit, I think, is important. It's also important to document that this was an Antifa op, but more importantly, the thing that I find that needs to be really like focused on here is that this claim of credit came hand in hand with I guess the hope that the attack would trigger what they said would be nationwide prison breaks and break-intos, prisons and detention centers. So basically, like, Antifa is hoping to, in the near future, focus on getting people out of prisons and breaking into prisons and detention centers as a form of like political rebellion. So yeah, I think that's it for today. It's kind of a shorter video. I didn't go over an hour today, which is cool. Yeah, I don't know. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. You guys can always email me from the site. I do have a Proton Mail set up if you have any tips that you are hoping to share or wanting to share, but you're concerned about whatever. I do have an encrypted Proton Mail, so you can send some tips there. You can send questions. I hope that I explained everything well, and if you guys want to read the article, you can always go to thenomanzone.com, where I list all my sources as well. So if you wanted to go through the sources, you can do that, including the original article that we just went over. You guys can see that whole article if you wanted to. But anyway, all right, thank you guys all for watching. Have a good day, and we will see you soon. Bye.